HD Tracks, a website offering high-resolution audio files, asked me to put together a list of 50 favorite recordings that are available on their site, both as files and as complete albums. What makes HD Tracks so special is that these are high-resolution files, much better audio than the highly condensed MP3 files. You know, when MP3 files first arrived, the web was much slower. We needed small files so they could be easily transportable. Now, everybody has faster internet. Why not have better sounding audio? MP3 files cut the highs, they cut the lows. You really don't hear the full spectrum. The files on HD Tracks sound much better. Here we go with a list of my top 50 jazz recordings on HD Tracks. I'm not able to give you audio samples, but each album has a link to the samples on HD Tracks. I suggest you check them out.
I remember when Dineo first arrived from Panama, he was playing with Paquito. In more recent years, incredible work with Wayne Shorter. You must hear this recording to check out the scope of Dineo's remarkable creativity. One of my favorite all-time recordings was Archie Shepp's Attica Blues, and here he revisits that incredible session with the Attica Blues Orchestra on the recording I Hear the Sound. As usual, Shepp can roar like a lion. Free for All, a 1964 recording with Art Blakey and the Jazz Messengers, could warm a frigid apartment on a bitter winter day. How could you go wrong with Freddie Hubbard and Wayne Shorter and Curtis Fuller on the front line? This is a rare 1949 live recording at the Shrine in L.A. by the piano master, Art Tatum. I once did an interview where Hank Jones talked about being at someone's apartment and thinking there were two piano players in the next room. It turned out to be an Art Tatum record. The collaboration of two masters is heard on Baggs Meets Wes Montgomery and Milt Jackson. I think one of the reasons they look so happy on the cover here is how great the session turned out. In addition to being an excellent saxophone player, both on alto and tenor, Oliver Nelson was a superb arranger and composer, and his album The Blues and the Abstract Truth is a classic, featuring his compositions including Stolen Moments, played by an all-star group including Freddie Hubbard and Eric Dolphy. Ammons and Sonny Stitt, another dynamite tenor man, used to play together quite a bit. And one night at a gig, Stitt played chorus after chorus of wild improvisation. What could follow that? Ammons picked up his horn and played one note. The crowd went wild. Cannonball Adderley made a number of memorable recordings with his own group, but this collaboration with Miles Davis is one of his best. Although he was well known on the Hammond B3 circuit in the 60s, Black Talk was Charles Earland, a.k.a. the Mighty Burners' first prestige recording and the first time for many people to hear his remarkable keyboard. The incredible lyricism of Chet Baker, both on the trumpet and vocally, is heard on a classic prestige recording, Chet Baker in New York. After playing with Miles and in a group called Circle with Anthony Braxton, Chico was looking for something with more of a light touch. And this recording features a number of compositions that have become jazz standards, including Spain and Light as a Feather. Coleman Hawkins encounters Ben Webster as Tenor Saxophone 101, featuring two of the most distinctive voices ever heard on the tenor saxophone. In between his days with Prestige and Impulse, John Corll did several recordings for the Atlantic label, including Coltrane Sound, with memorable versions of his own compositions, Equinox and Central Park West, as well as an important rendering of Body and Soul. People sometimes ask me, is there any good jazz being recorded today? David Chesky's Jazz and the New Harmonic is a organic extension of the classic jazz of the 50s and 60s with a more advanced harmonic twist, featuring a band that includes Javon Jackson, Billy Drummond, Jeremy Pelt, and Peter Washington. Not too shabby. I'm not afraid to admit that Lee Morgan is my favorite trumpet player and probably always will be. This recording from the mid-60s is a total delight. Two different sessions, a quintet date featuring Billy Higgins on drums and a big band. Oliver Nelson arrangements with Philly Joe Jones. McCoy Tyner plays on both, as well as the distinctive tenor saxophones of Joe Henderson and Wayne Shorter. A New Perspective is one of those recordings that you put on and don't take off. It features Donald Byrd in the mid-'60s when he first had Herbie Hancock in his group with a chorus playing the arrangements of Coleridge Taylor Perkinson and a very dynamic chorus. Nearly everyone has heard Christo Redentor. The word jazz is really an umbrella for a lot of different music. And although many people would call this an R&B recording, I think Donny Hathaway Live is a great jazz recording featuring some particularly stirring piano and vocals. Once musicians leave us, that's all we have is their recordings. And thankfully, Eddie Harris's A Tale of Two Cities documents his creativity, both as a comedian and a tenor player. Eddie Harris was a master, vastly underrated. Check this one out and see just how good he is. Eddie Lockjaw Davis, a descendant of Ben Webster's tenor playing, had a very distinctive sound. And on this Prestige recording featuring Shirley Scott on organ, he does cook. Of course we know Duke Ellington, and of course we know Ella Fitzgerald, but this is one of the only recordings where they play together. A 2-CD set full of fireworks, including some original compositions by Duke, specifically for Ella. With Billy Strayhorn on piano throughout, this is a keeper. This is one recording all jazz listeners must have. Dolphy at the 5-spot with Booker Little documents a couple of nights where these guys really got to stretch out. You hear Dolphy in a wonderfully supportive setting. Dedication by Herbie Hancock is a solo piano recording done in 1975, not released in the United States until the new millennium. Herbie works out on his classics like Maiden Voyage and some new things as well, demonstrating once again the man really knows his way around that keyboard. After Horace Silver's Song for My Father, his next recording was the Cape Verdean Blues, featuring an all-star horn section, J.J. Johnson, Woody Shaw, and Joe Henderson. The best acid rock band that has survived is England's Incognito, led by a guitarist named Bluey. I love their grooves. The 1962 recording Jazz Samba by Stan Getz and Charlie Byrd introduced everyone to the music of Brazil, particularly the bossa nova. Charlie Byrd's lyrical guitar provides the perfect setup for Getz's emotional tenor. It only happened one time, and thankfully, Charles Mingus, one of the musicians, brought a recorder to document the remarkable meeting of Charlie Parker, Dizzy Gillespie, Bud Powell, Max Roach, and Mingus in 1954 at Toronto's Jazz at Massey Hall. Surely one of the most important recordings in jazz history. Although the Crusaders, who once were the Jazz Crusaders, are pretty well known, Joe Sample's piano sometimes stays a little too far in the background for my taste. Here, he's front and center, and the result is a particularly impressive showcase of his composing and keyboard skills. In the early 70s, Keith Jarrett had already established quite a reputation as a jazz pianist. His work with Charles Lloyd, Miles Davis, and his own groups was particularly strong and memorable. And then he released this solo piano recording, somewhat different than his later long solo piano improvisations, that turned people's heads and still does. Nothing like a dynamic groove to get you moving. Lou Donaldson, a.k.a. Sweet Papa Lou, has always done that. And when he joined forces with organist Lonnie Smith, Alligator Boogaloo jumped to the top of the charts. Add guitarist George Benson and groove master Idris Muhammad on drums, and you've got one of the funkiest jazz records ever recorded. Pat Martino's El Hombre, his Prestige recordings, introduced the Philadelphia-born guitarist to the national spotlight, and guitarists have been studying his work ever since. Maynard Ferguson led one of the most cooking, exciting big bands ever to play jazz, and this documentation of a 1958 Newport appearance featuring arrangements by Slide Hampton is surely one of his best recordings. Joe Henderson and McCoy Tyner did a number of memorable Blue Note recordings, and in the early 90s they got back together for a New York reunion. a little older, a little wiser, but still full of fire. Miles Davis changed the world with his recordings In a Silent Way and Bitches Brew. And after Bitches Brew jumped to the top of the charts, he released Live Evil, which featured his band at the time, Gary Bartz, Keith Jarrett, Michael Henderson, and Jack DeJohnette. Look out. One of the great pianists of the late 20th century left us much too soon. His name was Mulgrew-Miller, and this live recording from Yoshi's in Oakland, California, captures his magic. How aptly named, The Night of the Cookers. Put Freddie Hubbard and Lee Morgan, two of the greatest trumpet players in jazz, in front of a cookin' rhythm section, and fasten your seatbelt. Charles Mingus was one of the most dynamic, unique figures in jazz, both as a bassist, a composer, and as a pianist. Here, with Doug Watkins on bass, a program of his compositions featuring Rahsaan Roland Kirk and Booker Ervin. Must listening. When Paquito de Rivera came from Cuba to New York with Irakere, he caused quite a sensation for his fiery alto saxophone playing. When he emigrated to the United States a few years after that as part of the Mariel boat crisis crowd, he was greeted with open arms, and as one of his first American recordings features pianist Danilo Perez. In 1963, when the bossa nova craze was at its height, everybody was recording the new sounds from Brazil. Quincy Jones, leading a big band during that time, wrote some charts, put together a group of top-flight studio musicians, and the result is big band bossa nova, which captures the emotionally satisfying feel of the Brazilian beat. Jazz is the music of individuals, and one of the most unique creators ever to pick up a horn was Rahsaan Roland Kirk. Best known for his multi-instrumental explorations, he's front and center here on tenor in one of the best recordings of his later years. There is only one Sonny Rollins, and when his tour de force Saxophone Colossus was released in the late 50s, everyone in the jazz world stood up and paid attention. Sonny Stitt was a double threat on tenor and alto saxophone, and in the late 60s, electrified his horn. Here, a live recording captures the dynamic sax player in a more relaxed setting. Red Garland and John Coltrane were part of Miles Davis's first great quintet in the 50s, and they recorded and played together quite a bit. Here, with Donald Byrd on trumpet, they get a chance to really stretch out. In the 70s, CTR Records came out with a number of hits that were produced by Creed Taylor, whose production elevated the music to a different level. Stanley Turrentine had been on the jazz scene for a long time, especially with Max Roach, but it was his recording Sugar with George Benson, Freddie Hubbard, and Ron Carter that put him on the charts. And there he stayed. Tommy Flanagan and Jackie Byard, two of the greatest pianists in jazz history. Tommy, perhaps better well known, Jackie, a pianist with encyclopedic knowledge of jazz history. The late Orrin Keepnews seemed to bring out the best in Thelonious Monk, including this solo recording on Riverside from the early 60s. Since the early 60s, with Art Blakey and the Jazz Messengers, Miles Davis and his own groups, along with Weather Report, Wayne Shorter has been one of the most influential tenor saxophonists and composers in jazz. This mid-60s session packs a powerful lineup with Wayne, Freddie Hubbard, Herbie Hancock, Ron Carter, and Elvin Jones. An absolute must for any serious jazz collection. Speaking of Weather Report, this album introduced us to Birdland and Jaco Pastorius, the bassist who left us much, much too soon. Frank Sinatra's concept recording, In the Wee Small Hours, was the perfect accompaniment for seduction. Brother Yusef Lateef was a gentle giant, a remarkably spiritual man who mastered every instrument he played.